"I've already found you a nice spot at the cemetery," said the husband to his fading wife. And when he returned from the sea with his mistress, "Look at what you've turned into. You look like a ghost, pale, hunched over. You look older than me. My mother even looks younger." Morgan once again made it clear to Caroline that he was barely tolerating her. Did she know that this understanding and compassionate brunette of short stature would turn into a real tyrant? And that his mother, who seemed like a kind and well-mannered lady, would turn out to be a hypocrite and a cruel liar, who was constantly slandering Caroline? Yes, maybe Morgan is right. She doesn't look great. Her mother also told her that she took after her poor little father, Alton. A pale moth. Her golden blonde hair always hangs like tow. Huge gray eyes, correct features, and a slender figure should have made her at least attractive, but no. She's so gloomy, she looks like a young old woman. The posture problems started back in school. That's when her father died, and it crushed Caroline. And her mother, it seemed, wasn't even that upset. She actually seemed to blossom. She started going on dates. That was really hurtful. Caroline tried to justify her mother in her mind, thinking that everyone experiences grief differently. Who knows what kind of reaction she could have had? If her mother never spoke of her father, it didn't mean she didn't love him. Or maybe her mother really just tolerated him. That would make more sense why she always reproached Caroline for resembling her father. "Morgan, listen, if I'm so unworthy of you, let's get a divorce," Caroline mumbled. Actually, she didn't expect that from herself. Her husband and mother-in-law had been humiliating her for 4 years. She was either a fool, or ugly, or lazy, or supposedly stealing the money allocated for groceries. She'd heard many things about herself, but she had never spoken of divorce. Deep down, Caroline was sure that suffering was just her fate. Maybe she was a lightning rod for such wild and rude people as her current relatives, or a prey for predators who would probably catch and devour her one day, especially if she weakened and stopped loving herself. She sometimes compared herself to a cow that stopped giving milk, so it was only fit to be slaughtered for meat, and that was that. Caroline didn't understand where and how she learned to justify malice and injustice, or rather, she didn't want to remember that her mother had always done that. And it didn't stop her mother from throwing her older sister out with the baby after their father's death. She should have fought, done anything. Yes, she was only 10, and Brenda was twice as old. So what? Caroline knew it wasn't fair. She should have left with her sister, raised a scandal, gone on a hunger strike, but she did none of that. She just stayed in her room for a month without talking to her mother. And then she bent, obeyed, and never mentioned Brenda again, as if she had never existed. Caroline still didn't know where her pregnant sister went, who refused to have an abortion. Maybe she had already died somewhere. Brenda was expecting a girl, and she wanted to name her Wendy. That's all Caroline remembered. No, she had never been capable of rebellion or even resistance. What to say about defending boundaries? Her mother was right, she was weak. So why did it come to this today? Why did she mention divorce? Caroline couldn't answer that question. But from Morgan's wide eyes, she understood. He was furious. What? Divorce? Do you know what they call women who run around after men once they're divorced? Do you want to join the many of them? Morgan added a curse word. He often did that. And Caroline hated him for it. She couldn't stand swear words. Her father never allowed himself such things. He said that swearing was disrespectful to both yourself and others. It was like throwing manure, trash, or putting a garbage can on someone's head. Morgan, listen, I don't want to live with you and your mother anymore. Yesterday she once again made up a story that I stole money and bought half the amount of groceries. And with you, we don't even have a friendly relationship. What's the point of all this? I thought I loved you. But now, I can barely stand you. Caroline knew that honesty wasn't really appropriate here, but she said it anyway. She was just scared of her silence. She was afraid that she would give in, be scared, retreat, and let herself be dragged back into the swamp. And it would be like it was with Brenda. Only this time, she would betray not her sister, but herself. What is she anyway? Wrong, crooked, lopsided, old and empty, lazy, stupid. Fine, let it be so, let them get off her back. She'd just go live in the apartment that belonged to her. A modest salary of a primary school teacher would be enough to keep a low profile and not get in anyone's way. Funny, this Morgan, he thinks I'll run off looking for someone else. He judges by himself. It's him who constantly comes home with lipstick stains and the scent of someone else's vulgar perfume. He stares with glazed, tin-like eyes and tries to keep a stone-faced expression. But it's clear that somewhere, where he's wallowing in dirt and lies, he feels good. So let him wander through muddy puddles like a pig. What does that have to do with Caroline? Why does he need her? To mock her and boss her around? You're disabled. How dare you say anything about my mother? She's a saint, putting up with such a simpleton. And I should be given a monument for this. That's what, dear. I wanted to be delicate, but you don't understand in a nice way. Remember that examination you went through, which, by the way, I paid for? Morgan asked. Caroline silently nodded. She had really been struggling to get to work lately. She even switched to part-time. She was constantly exhausted, always wanting to sleep. A couple of times, she almost got hit by a car. She just didn't notice the pedestrian light had turned red. Well, you've got a malignant brain tumor. The doctor said you have no more than 3 months to live. I'm living with a corpse. I'm putting up with it. And this is my thanks. Morgan pulled out a medical report from somewhere and ruthlessly threw it in front of Caroline. She couldn't make much sense of it, but it did say something about a malignant tumor. There was also an X-ray. Caroline started crying. Was she going to die? How could this happen? Her mother died from the same illness. She had walked around, having fun, mocking her daughter, and even planning to get married. Then suddenly, bam! She became a shadow of herself. For several years, Caroline had taken care of her mother, watching her gradually lose her sanity and ability to take care of herself. Her mother even forgot that Caroline was her daughter and smiled at her. Caroline was grateful for that little bit of love, even if it wasn't directed at her. Her mother took her for a nurse and was always kind to strangers. Morgan lived next door with his mother and once offered help, sympathized, praised Caroline for being a good daughter and not abandoning her mother. Then he began visiting more often, inviting her to his place. His mother, Bridget Archibald, seemed so sympathetic, listening, giving advice, supporting, and hinting that she would love to have such a reliable daughter-in-law for herself. And so, it happened that at 28, after her mother's death, Caroline was practically left an old maid. In her youth, she studied and always tried to get home quickly because her mother was very controlling and didn't like her staying out late. And then all her youth was spent caring for her mother. If you get pregnant by someone we don't know, you'll end up like Brenda, thrown out like trash, her mother threatened. Around the age of 23, Caroline started an affair with a former classmate. Alton had courted her during their studies, but her mother didn't approve of him. Who is he? An orphan from an orphanage, living in an old one-room apartment. How dare he approach a girl who lives in a 4-room apartment in the center of a good neighborhood? It seemed that Caroline's mother thought of people like snails, and their worth was measured by the houses they carried on their backs. No proper house? Or no house at all? Goodbye. Her mother also didn't approve of Brenda's choice. That's why he didn't marry her, even though he knew she was pregnant. And this is the result. Surely Brenda became homeless. And it wasn't her mother's fault. She gave birth to her and wished her well. But Brenda got involved with who knows whom. She refused to get rid of the child and now wanders around somewhere. So, if Caroline wants to follow in her footsteps, fine, let her go. That's what her mother used to say. And Caroline was scared. When Alton suggested they just get married right away, move in together, and forget about her mother and her tyrannical behavior, Caroline almost agreed. But then her mother fell ill, and she had to take care of her. You're lucky you didn't marry him. Better pay attention to Morgan, our neighbor. He lives in the same kind of apartment as we do. Handsome. And his mother is very decent, her mother said. She and Bridget Archibald weren't exactly friends, but they often gossiped about everyone and agreed that they were the upper class, and everyone else were fools. Why didn't I think back then that Bridget Archibald was unlikely to be a decent person if she mistreated the cleaning lady and all the poor neighbors? She herself went into the lion's den, and now it's too late. I'm sick. Is there anything worse than being completely defenseless in front of people who hated you even when you were healthy? That's what Caroline was thinking, recalling all her modest past. Maybe on my tombstone, it should say, lived foolishly and died the same way. Caroline didn't notice she said this out loud. She had already forgotten that Morgan was standing next to her. She had long since stopped respecting her husband. In some men's legends, wives who are oppressed and dominated immediately develop respect for their esteemed husbands. In reality, that never happens. Even the most scared one, who has nowhere to go, can't feel love or hate for an incomplete person for long. What else can you call someone who gets pleasure from humiliating a weaker person? Caroline had long stopped seeing Morgan as a person. He was just a tool in the hands of some evil forces that possess weak people. And their goal was to make everyone around them miserable, with the tormentors getting pleasure from turning into machines of cruelty. And those who were tortured became like amoebas, just frozen in the hope of dying. It's your fault. Of course, if you allowed them to treat you like that, you had to get sick. Yeah, since you're talking about a tombstone, know this, I've already picked out a great spot for you. Mom's friend recovered and decided to spend the money on repairs. She's giving up her spot at a good cemetery for very cheap. By the way, there's even a tombstone. You just need to change the photo and the date. Well, the exact date isn't known yet, Morgan smirked. He didn't want his wife to recover and divorce him. He was already mentally living in her pre-marriage apartment, which would be his. Who else would it go to? Her sister had disappeared long ago, her parents were dead, and his wife didn't have much time left either. So, he let her go, this sickly woman with property, off to a free life. She picked the wrong fight. Her friend, who had bought a cemetery plot and a tombstone in advance, really did exist. But she had bought all of that for her husband, whom she couldn't stand. But he still left the family and wouldn't put up with her scandals, and her mother's friend had borrowed money from her for repairs. They arranged to settle the debt this way. Mom bargained well. So, everything was supposed to be as cheap as possible. And it didn't matter that there were trash bins nearby, Caroline wouldn't care anymore. You're talking about this so calmly? But I'm sick, and I'm not necessarily going to die right away. My mom was sick for many years, Caroline protested. Although she knew there was no conscience to which she could appeal. But that's how kind-hearted and naive people are, even after fully realizing the soullessness and cruelty of others, they still hope for something. After all, it's like 2 hands, 2 legs, a body, a head, and in human form, Morgan, and you forget that human form doesn't necessarily come with the body. Morgan just wanted to finish her off. By the way, you were talking about suspecting me of cheating. Well, they say the truth benefits the dying. I want you to know. I've been cheating on you. All the time. With different women, if that comforts you. And to not disturb you while you die, I'll delicately leave with my current lover to the sea. And try not to be here when I come back. It'll be worse for you, Morgan laughed. With these words, he handed her the documents for the plot, explained how to find it if she was interested, and even sent the coordinates to her phone, adding that the place was very scenic, so she could visit it at her leisure, reflect, and get used to it. You're a pitiful excuse for a human. Caroline, with sudden strength, slapped her husband hard. Surprisingly, he staggered, even though he was much stronger and taller. I won't hit you. Instead, I'll dance on your grave this year, Morgan hissed with a vicious grin. Tears streamed from Caroline's eyes, but she didn't care. She didn't even wipe them away. What difference did it make now? The next day, her husband was dramatically fussing in front of the mirror, getting ready, asking his mother which shirts and t-shirts he should take on vacation. The relatives had decided to stop hiding that his current lover was a promising businesswoman. So, if everything went well, he wouldn't have to work as a manager for pennies anymore. He would rise to a higher position, and who knows, maybe even become an owner. It's well known that even the toughest and most businesslike women just dream of a strong man by their side. You fix a shelf for them, and they buy you a car. You fix an outlet, and they renovate your apartment. The mere presence of a man in the house already obliges you to make him rich. That's the kind of nonsense that Morgan and his mother, without even hiding it from Caroline, were talking about on the day of departure. She couldn't take it anymore and laughed. How can anyone be so stupid? This was beyond the level of cheap TV shows, it was something even worse. Where did they get all this outdated nonsense? See, you're losing your husband. I told you, you should have held on to him. You're the one who mentioned divorce yesterday. In the summer, Bridget usually spent weekends at her country house to give herself a break. But her son warned her about the trip and asked her to look after sick Caroline. That's why she showed up. Oh, I must be really stupid, Caroline replied ironically. After yesterday's conversation with her husband, it was as if she had woken up from a long and foolish, painful sleep. Everything suddenly fell into place. She was living with people who didn't love her at all. Caroline had once thought she had deep feelings for her husband, but now it became clear she had loved an imagined version of him. In her heart, there wasn't the real Morgan, but the devoted friend and compassionate person she had once seen when they first met. Don't be sarcastic. Her mother-in-law felt the double meaning in Caroline's words and became suspicious, but then quickly reminded her of something important. The tenants of Caroline's apartment were moving out today. They had transferred the money to Bridget's account, as usual. But it was necessary to check the condition in which they were leaving the apartment. And, of course, to clean it up. I've already found new tenants. They're coming tomorrow to look at the apartment. Everything needs to be in order, understand? Her mother-in-law shot a stern look at her. But this time the fear the dragon tactic didn't work. Caroline wasn't scared. She laughed even louder. Wow, she had really sunk so low. Her whole salary was being taken away. Her apartment was being rented out. Meanwhile, she was cooking, cleaning, listening to complaints. What a fool she was. She'd fallen into such a simple trap. They were cooking her like a frog, slowly heating the water. First, her husband seemed to just become stricter. Then he began to be a little rude. And what came after, Caroline couldn't quite remember. But the transition from being the beloved wife to the powerless slave had happened so naturally, as if a stone had just rolled down a hill. What's wrong with her today? Her mother-in-law fumed. She no longer addressed Caroline and looked at her son. It was clear that talking to a void wasn't worth much. Mom, don't pay attention. Looks like it's the medicine, Morgan said condescendingly. What medicine? Caroline asked, suddenly on edge. She had just found out about her diagnosis yesterday. She hadn't been prescribed anything yet, and she wasn't taking anything. Morgan suddenly widened his eyes in fear, flushed. Bridget nudged him in the shoulder as if to say, "Why did you say that?" "Oh, right, I forgot. You haven't been to the hospital yet. So many things have been going on. I made an appointment for you at a private clinic tomorrow. You'll go with my mom, and they'll prescribe treatment for you. Mom, you won't leave Caroline alone, will you?" Morgan chirped. "Of course, even though she's rude to me all the time and treats me disrespectfully, I'm above that, and I try to treat her like a person who needs help," her mother-in-law pouted. Caroline pretended that this explanation was perfectly fine with her, but she thought something was off. Lately, her mother-in-law had taken to bringing her a jug of water in her room. She knew Caroline didn't like tea or coffee, and the young woman had been very surprised by this care from someone who couldn't even find snow in winter. But now it became clear that they were most likely putting something in it. When her mother-in-law left with her son to see him off at the airport, Caroline poured the remaining water from the jug into a special bottle. Then the tenants who were moving out of her apartment called, just at the right time. Caroline called a locksmith service and made an urgent order for the locks to be changed within the hour. Then she packed the most necessary things into 2 suitcases and simply moved back into her own apartment. She felt an immense sense of relief. She didn't fully understand what was happening or what would come next, but right now, this was the right thing to do. And even if Caroline really was dying, she didn't want to be around those who hated her. She decided that she would file for divorce the very next day. She didn't have much savings, but she could call Alton. He hadn't become a teacher after all. He decided to study law and continue the family business. His grandfather had convinced his daughter to give up an illegitimate child and put him in an orphanage. But no other children came along. Eventually, the family regretted their decision. Alton was found, warmed up, and persuaded to work in the family business. Now Alton was no longer the former orphan living in a rundown place on the outskirts. He was a fairly wealthy and successful man. If he measured everything, like Caroline's mother did, by achievements and property, he would never talk to her. But Alton was different. He probably hadn't changed. He had always been kind and responsive. And even though she had caused him great pain, probably because of the feelings that once developed, he wouldn't refuse to help her in a tough situation. She decided to call him now, before her mother-in-law returned, noticed her absence, and created a big scene. She'd figure something out. After all, although Bridget thought Caroline belonged to her along with all the property, legally, that wasn't the case. And if Bridget caused trouble, they could just call the police. Alton, hi, it's me. She didn't even say her name. It was only after a minute of silence on the phone that she realized he might have already forgotten about her. I mean, it's me, Caroline. I need your help. Caroline? Do you really think I wouldn't recognize you? After I was going to marry you and spend my life with you? You know, I may seem like an idiot, but actually, I'm fine in my head, Alton said, offended. His voice was so familiar. Why hadn't she turned to him for help or at least advice before? Alton had always been a kind, wise man. He wouldn't have refused to help her. Alton, who else is there? An irritated and somewhat squeaky female voice from the other side seemed to protest against their conversation. Caroline suddenly felt very sad. So, she had missed her chance. He must have already started a family, or at least had a steady relationship. What was she hoping for? That Alton would wait for her forever? And this after Caroline herself had let her mother drive him away with a scandal, and she hadn't said a word in protest. She even added that he really shouldn't call her again, so her mother wouldn't be upset. What had Alton said then? He seemed to have said that if he was needed, she should call him. And also that he would never forget her. Maybe he does remember, but now there's someone else beside him. And there's no place for her. Well, fine. Alton, if I'm disturbing you, it's not that urgent, Caroline mumbled, already wanting to hang up and never call him again. She didn't think it would hurt so much. She thought she had forgotten him. But in reality, she had just buried him under a layer of memories. She had temporarily frozen him, and now spring had come, or something like that. No, speak, I know you. You wouldn't have called if it wasn't urgent. By the sound of it, he had stepped into another room. His voice became muffled and echoed. Well, I'm dying. I just came back to my apartment. I want a quick divorce and not to talk to my ex and his mother. And I also need to figure out something else, Caroline blurted out all at once. Of course, she was a grown woman and understood that there were no more knights who could easily solve all the problems. So what? Even just dumping it all on Alton made her feel a little better. Where are you now? Asked Alton. I'm at home. But I want to warn you that I won't be able to give you the money right away. But later, when everything is over, I'll pay even more. Whatever you want, I'll pay. I'm going to die anyway, Caroline sniffed. Wait a minute. Are you still living at the same address? Clarified Alton. He said he would come in an hour at most, and then they could discuss everything. By the sound of it, Alton thought she was drunk, crazy, or just unreasonable. Or maybe he had always thought of her this way. Caroline didn't know the answer to that. She had been too absorbed in her own suffering before and hadn't noticed other people. She was just starting to emerge now. She needed to learn to think for herself. To make conclusions by observing, not just digging through emotional turmoil all day. Alton arrived surprisingly quickly. Caroline was amazed that he hadn't changed much. Still plump, with red hair, high receding hairlines, and soft facial features. He looked like a big doll. No wonder his life was on the rise, as she had heard. Alton knew how to charm people. And he was smart, knowledgeable, and decent, rare qualities for a lawyer. So, what happened? I thought you were drunk, but you look fine, lost some weight, though, and you're pale, kind of upset, Alton said in a businesslike tone, pulling ready meals from a bag that he had brought, along with a few bottles of juice. Want some? Caroline only now remembered she hadn't eaten anything since morning, and now her stomach was growling. Oh right, I forgot about food. And you, as always, thought of everything, she said while stuffing her cheeks, and they discussed the situation. All right, I'm your lawyer now. Later we'll make it official with a contract. But for now, I'll answer your phone, or you'll lose it completely. Do you know what lawyers are really most needed for? Asked Alton. For a quick divorce? Asked Caroline. Well, that's a bonus. Actually, a lawyer is like a cleaner after a party. A butcher, a proctologist, or anyone who does the unpleasant work for others. It's not hard for us lawyers to listen to hysterics. We're tough. But for our clients, one conversation like that can destroy them. You can't get that health back, Alton explained, adding that, statistically, during divorces or inheritance disputes, the most sensitive people could actually die in the process, never waiting for the result. Moreover, Alton suspected that some, especially delicate wives and husbands, nobly left this world early for no reason, simply because they weren't loved, and admitting that was too painful to talk about. Got it? How necessary are lawyers? My grandfather explained that to me when I didn't want to join the family firm. Yeah, great. I'm not the only cowardly idiot, Caroline replied with her mouth full. An hour later, the phone rang. It was her mother-in-law. Alton winked at Caroline. Symbolically, he mimed putting on rubber gloves and picked up the receiver. Well, what have you done, you little imp? What's with that silly note? Couldn't you have discussed it all? Normal people talk things through, they don't run away from problems, Bridget screamed. She was sure Caroline was listening attentively. Hello, this is the lawyer of Mrs. Alton mentioned Caroline's last name and asked her to introduce herself. Who are you? Has Caroline found herself a lover? How dare you mock me? Her mother-in-law raged. Listen, if you have doubts, we can schedule a meeting at my office. I'll send you my business card when we're done talking. Do you have anything substantive to say? Alton spoke calmly. Bastard! Bridget shouted. It was as though a cold shower had been thrown on her. She almost choked with indignation. I forgot to warn you. From now on, all calls will be recorded. And you'll be held accountable for your words according to the current laws. And I'll still send you my business card, Alton said and hung up the phone. No, Bridget won't calm down that easily, Caroline said. And she was right. Just 10 minutes later, someone tried to open the door with a key, but the locks had already been changed. Then they started banging and ringing the doorbell insistently. Bridget was shouting that she would get to the scoundrel. Alton wanted to go out and talk to her mother-in-law or call the police, but Caroline asked him not to. She didn't want Bridget to realize that Alton was her close friend. "It's better if she thinks I planned all this and prepared for a long time," Caroline whispered. "Listen, you're like a child. Your mother-in-law is just an ordinary person. Sure, she's vile and scandalous, but still just ordinary. Why are you so afraid of her?" Alton was surprised. "I guess I'm just used to it," Caroline shrugged. Her mother-in-law left and began sending text messages asking Caroline to at least think about her health. The tone was now different, conciliatory. "By the way, about your health. You said you took water from the jug. Let me have it analyzed." "I have a friend in the lab," Alton suggested. They agreed that Caroline would leave the house carefully. Alton, just in case, would set up video surveillance in her apartment and even offered that if it became too difficult, she could move in with him. "No, don't, it's inconvenient. Your family might misunderstand." Caroline clearly remembered the displeased female voice she had overheard during the call. "No, they understand everything and won't mind at all," Alton replied. "They? So, besides his wife, he has a child? Maybe even more than one? What was I expecting? Alton is already 4 years older than me. And now he's doing well," Caroline thought sadly, and said goodbye to him coldly. It was all right. They set up the call forwarding for her mother-in-law and husband to Alton. The torturers already knew the bird had flown from the cage, and Alton would help with the divorce. Now they just needed to figure out what was going on with her health and how bad it was. Alton said he would start by analyzing the water. He took her medical documents confirming her diagnosis. He was going to find out everything through his channels. And then they'd see. The next day, Caroline had nothing to do. School was still on break. Alton wouldn't find out anything so quickly. So, she decided to go to the cemetery and check the plot her husband and mother-in-law had bought for her. Caroline didn't want to hope for a completely good outcome of her situation. She couldn't fall for Alton's charm and believed that she would survive. But still, it felt nice that, even just before her death, she had managed to shake off the chains of slavery. Sometimes Caroline watched programs where famous actresses and even businesswomen talked about how they had endured humiliations from their own families for years. Each of them said that it was never too late and that even one sip of freedom was worth all the efforts. Caroline had never believed these words before. What was the point of struggling when you couldn't have children, were sick, and weren't even wanted by your own mother? And you were to blame for everything. Who would need a miserable, slouching wreck in this life? No one would even notice if she were gone. It was too late to try to change anything. Her inability to have a child was another punishment. Alton was lucky he hadn't married her. It was fine. Now he had found someone normal and was happy in a regular marriage. And Morgan was right in some ways. No matter what she did, Caroline was empty. And the clinic confirmed that. So it wasn't surprising that her husband couldn't love her and started taking lovers. He just wanted to continue his lineage. It was instinct, you couldn't fight it. Maybe Alton would have left her too if he knew everything. Being unable to have children was a serious flaw. And because of that, Caroline was incomplete. Her mother had never loved her and made it clear. Caroline used to console herself by thinking that at least her father loved her. But that was just her perception. Compared to her mother, one could say that her father was loving. In reality, he was quite indifferent toward his daughters. Yes, he tried, earned money, didn't harm them, and sometimes even pretended to listen. But Caroline clearly remembered how relieved her father was when he retreated to his room, and how happy he was when his daughters didn't need anything from him. He always longed for peace and loved only her mother. Unrequitedly, painfully, but he couldn't leave her. And her mother loved his apartment, his salary, and the feeling of absolute power over him. She would never leave her husband. That was their family life. When Morgan cynically laughed about buying her a grave at a good price, Caroline noticed that the plot was somewhere near her father's burial place. She was almost sure that it was true, and that was another reason why she came here today. Caroline often came to talk to her father at his grave, always apologizing for disturbing him. Her mother, from the neighboring gravestone, would look at her sternly, pursing her lips, as if offended that this nonsense was bothering them here too. But there was no one else to come. Everything is relative. And so, it could be stretched to say that her father loved her. At least a little. "Excuse me, could you tell me how far apart these plots are?" Caroline asked a cemetery keeper passing by. She had printed out a map but couldn't quite orient herself. "Let me have a look." Fortunately, the keeper was in a good mood and agreed to help. He even walked with Caroline to the plot she needed. "Here, look, and that grave is just across the row. You can see it from here. Are you planning to bury someone close to your parents?" Arnold Barlow had seen Caroline here often. She regularly asked him to paint the fence or do some repairs and was always generous with payment. So, he knew her well. Not many people visited their relatives regularly. Yes, someone close. I'd like it to be near." Caroline smiled at the thought that, unknowingly, Morgan and his mother had bought the perfect plot for her. She would still be close to her parents. "Ah, well then it's fine." The keeper started asking about the future occupant of the grave. Would the coffin be standard and would a headstone be needed in a year? But that's a little later. "You see, this person hasn't passed away yet," Caroline confessed. She felt uneasy with these clarifications. Goosebumps ran down her skin. The keeper was explaining everything a bit too realistically. Though Arnold Barlow wasn't to blame. He didn't know it was her own grave. "Oh, well, never mind. When they die, just come by. As they say, no rush." With these words, he said goodbye. "Oh, thanks, at least for that." Caroline sighed and was about to head to her parents' grave. But what was there to see at her own plot? Nothing interesting. Hope suddenly shifted to despair. Yes, she would definitely die. Maybe even before the frost sets in. Then, she wouldn't have to hit the ground with a shovel, cracking the ice. It would be easier for everyone. Well, it's all right. At least peace would come afterward. No one would disturb her again. It was just a pity that she couldn't find Brenda. She had spent all the savings left from her mother on a detective agency. No trace. How could this happen? What if she's dead now? That would be irresponsible. What if my sister lost her memory, then remembers, comes back, and no one's waiting for her? I should at least write a will for her. For such cases. And I shouldn't die before the divorce, thought Caroline, and started crying again. The bright sun illuminated her patch of land. The only valuable gift her husband and mother-in-law had given her. Yes, she lived foolishly, and would die foolishly. On her future grave lay a piece of tarpaulin. Apparently, someone had thrown it there by mistake. Not right, Caroline thought, and went over to remove it. When she lifted the dirty tarpaulin, she froze. Underneath, there was a little girl, about 6 years old, with a well-worn stuffed bear under her head. The toy had been patched up many times and hadn't been washed in ages. The bright sun hit the girl's eyes. She reluctantly stretched and looked at Caroline with clear blue eyes. "Are you going to kick me out?" she asked in a thin voice, then coughed. It was no wonder she hadn't caught a cold sleeping on the damp ground under the tarpaulin. And who would let a little girl be alone at the cemetery? "No, why do you think that?" Caroline asked, startled. The appearance of this little girl on her future grave was more than unexpected. "They always chase me away." "I guess they'll be burying someone here," the little girl said calmly. And explained, she understood that you couldn't sleep on top of the deceased, they might get offended. So, she chooses empty plots. She's a good girl and understands everything. "My name is Caroline." "What's yours?" the woman asked gently. She understood the girl needed help, but didn't yet know what to do. "My name is Brenda. After my mom. My sister said she loved us very much, But I don't remember her, the little girl admitted. Caroline flinched. Why was this little girl, who looked so much like her older sister, also named the same as her? Was life mocking her? Wasn't it enough that she already had so many problems and sufferings? That's a nice name. My sister's name is the same. I love her very much. But she disappeared and hasn't shown up. Caroline didn't know what to say, so she simply shared what she felt. Maybe something happened to her, like with my sister. Amanda is really nice, but she was tricked. The girl began to tell her story, a little incoherently. Apparently, she and her older sister had ended up in an orphanage after their mother died. Amanda had taught her to come to the cemetery and ask for candies and treats. Sometimes, they were even given money. When it was time for Amanda to leave the orphanage, she wanted to take her sister. She married a guy who seemed reliable, promised to earn money, but in the end, Amanda ended up in prison. She was accused of theft. Brenda had a breakdown, and the caretakers decided to find her a family right away. Before, the girls had stuck together, insisting that they should only be adopted together. This scared away people who wanted only a little child. But now, alone, Brenda could no longer resist. She didn't want to be separated from her sister. The mean caretaker said that even if Amanda was released, no one would ever let her take responsibility for Brenda. That's when the little one became upset and ran away. She hid in the cemetery and had been there for a few days. No one had found her until Caroline. She had been eating whatever people left on the graves. No, this won't do. You can't stay here. Someone could hurt you or you might freeze to death or starve. You're already coughing, Caroline said. So what? If I die, I'll be next to my mom. She loved me. What's there to be afraid of? The little girl asked. And she looked at Caroline so intensely that she couldn't hold back her tears. The little, desperate girl with the dirty, patched-up bear was trying to defeat fate on her own in any way she could. Fighting for her freedom. So small, so unfortunate. And Caroline, with her apartment, education, and, in the past, her health, hadn't even tried to defend herself. It hurt her deeply. Here's the plan, come with me. I'll tell the keeper you're the niece of a sick woman who's going to be buried here. You got upset and ran away, and I found you. Then no one will suspect anything. You know, this is my grave, Caroline said softly. She didn't want to scare the girl. Yours? Aren't you too young to die? Brenda asked, surprised. Well, who knows? People die at any age. Maybe I'll change my mind? Caroline smiled and winked at the girl. She didn't want to upset her. The little girl was lucky that the weather was warm. What would have happened if Caroline hadn't come today? It was terrifying to think about. Caroline decided she needed to take Brenda with her right away. After that, she'd figure out where to find her sister and come up with something. Visiting her parents' grave today wasn't going to work, so she just waved at them from a distance, and somehow, she thought her usually stern mother was smiling from the portrait today. She then called a taxi and went home. On the way, she bought some new clothes for Brenda and everything she could change her into. She also bought a new bear. But the girl looked at it suspiciously and said, "If this is my bear's brother, then I'll take him. But if it's in place of him, I don't need him. You can't abandon old friends. Don't worry, no one's abandoning your bear. I'm just going to wash him a bit. You know, bears really like to bathe," Caroline said once they were home. Okay, then he can have a brother. The guest ate and immediately fell asleep. Caroline called Alton again. She knew she was probably bothering him, but who else could she turn to? Over the course of her marriage, she had lost all her friends. Only now did she realize that Morgan had deliberately said nasty things to all her friends. He had intentionally isolated her from everyone. He hoped that this way, she wouldn't escape. But if even little Brenda was fighting for the right to live as she saw fit, then Caroline was destined to do the same. Oh, I see you're not going to let me get bored, Alton whispered, so he wouldn't wake up the little girl in the other room. He told her that the situation with her medical records was quite suspicious. Even at first glance, there were many inconsistencies. So, he had already arranged for Caroline to be examined again at another hospital. As for the water, he had sent it for analysis, but the results hadn't come in yet. How are my former relatives doing? Caroline asked. Mentally, she had already placed not only her husband, but also his mother in the former category. Oh, that's a whole different story. Your mother-in-law came to our office today and caused a huge scene. She said you were crazy, incompetent, and that we were allegedly using this situation for our own benefit. And she plans to prove it. Alton told her that Bridget Archibald had let slip about her connections in the medical world, which struck him as very suspicious. By the way, did you know that your Morgan was married before and then became a widower? Wait, what? He never told me that. Caroline was shocked. Exactly. And you know, before she died, his first wife was in that very clinic where you've been getting your tests. Officially, she died from heart failure, but they were treating her for anemia. Isn't that strange? Alton asked, suddenly becoming very serious. More than strange, Caroline agreed with him. She had asked Morgan before if he had ever had serious relationships. After all, Morgan was 12 years older. He must have had a history. But her husband told her he was an old bachelor who was looking for the one. Then he met Caroline and vanished. In short, he delivered a bunch of cliches. And here's the interesting part, Caroline. The deceased had quite a bit of money in her account from selling an apartment. And before she died, it disappeared. Her relatives tried to find out where it went, but Morgan explained that she gave it to charity. But, after meeting your mother-in-law, I'm starting to doubt that. She's a very sly lady, Alton added. Yeah, they already gave me a grave. It seems to be the tradition in their family, Caroline agreed. All right, you'll go for another examination tomorrow. And one more thing. Whether you like it or not, I'm taking you from here today. I didn't want to tell you, but your mother-in-law has a criminal history. She was involved in some pretty serious crimes when she was younger. Alton revealed that Bridget Archibald had worked as a black market realtor and had helped more than one person depart this world. Not everything was proven, but what was proven was enough for her to spend 7 years behind bars. After that, she captured a married, wealthy man, had a son with him, and somehow managed to get him to give her this apartment. In fact, Morgan's father wanted nothing more to do with her. Same for the son. Alton tried to find out more, but the man just had a breakdown, claiming she blackmailed him and separated him from his wife. She ruined his life. He didn't elaborate further. Alton finished his story. That's a strange story. But Bridget told me she was a widow. She said her husband died from some illness. Caroline couldn't quite process all the new information. One thing's clear. You'll stay with me for now. And Brenda too. Tomorrow I'll try to find out more about her sister, Alton said. Listen, they won't barge into my apartment, will they? I don't want to cause you any problems with your wife and kids, Caroline blushed. Wait, who said I have a wife and kids? Alton was surprised. I heard it. When I called you the first time, there was an unhappy woman next to you, and you mentioned a family you live with, Caroline explained. Oh, you mean Rebecca? She's my grandfather's young wife. A very pushy woman who gets involved in everything. My family consists of my grandfather and my mother. They feel guilty about me, which is why they insisted I live in their fancy house. To be honest, I dream of living on my own. But I kind of pity them, too, Alton confessed. Well, if that's the case, I won't be in the way. You know, I didn't want to admit it, but I'm really scared to live here now. I'm always afraid someone will start knocking or calling, Caroline admitted. If I were you, I'd be more afraid of getting hit by a car or falling off the stairs. But your reasoning is right. It's not safe here, Alton agreed. They waited for the little one to wake up, then headed to Alton's family home. Caroline gasped when they pulled up to a large mansion with a perfect lawn and flower beds. Brenda was amazed at how many fountains and little roses there were. "Wow, you're like some kind of oligarch," Caroline exclaimed. "Exactly. So, it's time for you to chase me while I'm still available." Alton winked. Caroline couldn't tell if he was joking or making an offer. However, she had always been called slow since childhood. They walked toward the entrance, where they were greeted by a blonde woman in a tight red suit. She was about 40 but tried to look younger. "This is my grandfather's latest young wife, Rebecca," Alton introduced the lady. "Alton, what is this? With all your options, you chose a woman with a child?" The blonde immediately protested. "Rebecca, Grandpa and Mom won't be happy that you're interfering with my personal life," Alton said sternly. Then he turned to Caroline and Brenda and winked. "Fine, do whatever you want, I don't care," the blonde pouted. Then, in an indifferent voice, she said that dinner would be in half an hour. No, we're not ready to face the public just yet." "We'll have dinner by ourselves," said Alton. "Well, suit yourself." Rebecca clearly wasn't pleased with everything and anything. Things moved quickly after that. The next day, the test results came in, and Caroline found out that she had been unknowingly taking quite strong medications for a while, which explained her weakness. A week later, two pieces of news came at once. First, it turned out that Caroline wasn't actually ill, just exhausted from the medication she had been unknowingly given. Second, Amanda, Brenda's sister, wasn't in prison at all but was still under investigation. Thanks to Alton's connections, it was proven that she had no involvement in the affairs of the young rich man who had seduced her and promised to help her retrieve her sister from the orphanage. "I thought we would have a fake marriage. Alexander was reliable, from a rich family, but it turned out he was a thief and almost dragged me into it," Amanda confessed. It also turned out that the orphanage caretakers had their own agenda. Brenda had caught the eye of some capricious lady who bribed them to allow her to adopt the girl. The lady's late daughter, who had died in a car accident, looked very much like Brenda. So, one of the bribed caretakers had been pressuring the little girl, telling her that her sister was in prison and would never get out. "Well, it really will be hard for you to take your sister, but I can adopt Brenda, and you can live with us too," Caroline offered. Alton pulled her aside and asked, "Are you sure? Haven't you thought about the fact that your husband and mother-in-law also lied to you about your infertility? Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. This girl, Brenda, came into my life for a reason. Let the girls live with me. She looks so much like my late sister, and they even gave her the same name," Caroline said. "All right. Then I recommend you build a proper family after the divorce. That way, your chances will increase." Alton patted his chest, making it clear that he was open to being considered as the next husband. "This isn't how I imagined our reunion," Caroline blurted out unexpectedly, realizing she had let something slip, and blushed. I knew you were thinking about me. I'm reliable, kind, white, and fluffy. I've always loved you." "And I still do," Alton replied happily. "So you're not offering me a fake marriage?" Caroline asked for clarification. "Whatever you want. The main thing is, never leave me again," Alton said seriously, looking her in the eye. Caroline realized he wasn't joking. Then began the noisy divorce process. Morgan still didn't want to give up the apartment. Apparently, he had gotten attached to it. So, he tried to prove Caroline's insanity to his own detriment. In the end, his late wife's relatives and his current mistress united and concluded that he was a highly suspicious and dangerous person. Morgan's real father finally gave testimony, revealing that his son and Bridget Archibald had been involved in shady dealings. It was his mother who had involved Morgan in criminal activity. The body of his first wife was exhumed, and it was proven that she hadn't died of natural causes. This led to a loud trial about the doctors at the hospital who had covered up all these misdeeds. The whole process dragged on for 2 years. In the end, Bridget Archibald and her son were imprisoned. When Caroline went to visit her parents' grave again, she noticed that the plot given to her was occupied by someone else. From the gravestone, her mother-in-law was staring at her with her lips tightly pressed together. That's how Caroline learned that the saying, "Don't dig a hole for someone else, or you might end up in it," can come true in the most literal sense. Her mother-in-law had never officially transferred the plot to Caroline, so when she died, Morgan decided to save money and bury his mother there. He had already lost the apartment due to his shady dealings. He had hidden away a little something for a rainy day, but not much. So, he used the grave plot. And Caroline discovered for herself, without any medical tests, that she was far from infertile. Already married to Alton, she became pregnant and was preparing to become the mother of a boy. "You're such a wonderful person, Caroline. You know, my aunt's name was Caroline too. My mom used to tell me a lot about her, but she wasn't quite right in the head, so she couldn't remember where she lived." Amanda had never mentioned this before. Yes, Caroline knew that her mother had been robbed and hit on the head when she was young, which made her forget much of her past. But the fact that her aunt was named Caroline, that she had never shared. What if it's a 1 in a million chance? Her heart beat anxiously. Caroline had seen the girl's documents. It said that Amanda had lived with a woman who had no papers and worked illegally as a dishwasher. Then she had a second daughter, and shortly after her birth, she died. "Amanda, do you have a photo of your mom?" Caroline asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Just one." "Do you want to see it?" the girl asked. "Of course." Amanda ran to her room and brought her passport. Behind the cover was a photo of a woman smiling with 2 daughters. It was definitely Brenda. Caroline was sure of it, but decided to do a DNA test anyway, just to be certain. The result came when she had already given birth to Charlie. It turned out that the girls were indeed her nieces. She told Amanda right away, but decided to wait a little longer to tell little Brenda, letting her grow a bit first. She was lucky with the girls. Amanda had a talent for law and was planning to become a lawyer, just like her stepfather. She said she would help women in desperate situations. Little Brenda was great at drawing. Caroline always remembered that her own sister had also dreamed of becoming an artist, but she never told that to the girl. Let her draw for herself. This time, fate would surely smile, and the brave little girl would be happy. Little Charlie had no talents yet, except for his ability to love every member of the family. Even Rebecca couldn't help but smile at the sight of the baby, although she said she couldn't stand children. Caroline later found out that she simply couldn't have children of her own. Alton was eager to move to a separate place. But Grandpa, his mother, and even Rebecca refused to let him, Caroline, or the children go anywhere. "Well, if we're bothering you so much, you do have a separate entrance." "How much longer do I have, huh?" Grandpa manipulated his grandson. It was obvious that he had a long life ahead of him. Caroline could only envy his health. Grandpa did 100 push-ups every day and complained that he had to take just one 5-minute break. All right, if Caroline doesn't mind, Alton was hoping that his wife would intervene and insist that they live separately. But Caroline liked that everyone here loved each other so much that she didn't want to leave. She realized that she had finally found a family.